Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's HathiTrust webcast. I am here with Executive Director Mike Furlow, Director of Services and Operations Sandra McIntyre, and Member Engagement and Communications Specialist Jessica Rohr to talk about continuation of the Emergency Temporary Access Service for fall of 2020. First, some housekeeping. Next slide, please. All right. So please keep your microphones and cameras off for today's presentation. If you have any questions at any time, please type them into the chat window. We do have some staff monitoring the chat window, but for the sake of the recording, I'm going to read most of the questions out loud to the presenters at certain points during the presentation. All right, now it's time to get started. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Furlow. Mike?
Thanks. Thanks, Melissa. Hello, everyone. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope that you and your friends and family and your colleagues all continue to be safe and healthy. I've said before that it's never been more clear that our collective fates are intertwined, and I'm glad to be a part of a community that recognizes that. Today, we're here to talk about the continuation of emergency temporary access services. This is a service we initially launched back in March, and when we were beginning to conceive of it, we really didn't have a very clear understanding of what our future months were going to look like. But what's clear to us now is that this fall and into 2021 for HathiTrust, our most important priority is going to be to support you and support your students and faculty in their efforts to continue their research, teaching, and learning. So our intention is to continue to offer this service as long as members continue to endure situations that call for it. So as hard as it probably was for you to shut your library back in the spring, I'm imagining that right now trying to figure out how to reopen safely under these conditions is even harder, and you're dealing with many unknowns and many uncertainties, and many of you have been in touch with us about those. Some of you on this webcast are continuing to deal with conditions that make you eligible to continue the access for this service. Others may be here today who have already discontinued the service. But during this webcast, what we're intending to do is just talk about these situations in more detail. We'll try to clarify some things that aren't clear for you. We're collecting some information right now about your continuing need for the service, and we'll talk about how we'll use that information. And we'll have plenty of time for questions as well, so use that chat box to add yours. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone, and also a welcome from me. I know this has been on people's minds from the very beginning. I would say that as we were doing the initial webcasts and beginning to introduce the service and asking people what else they wanted to hear about, it actually was something that people wanted to hear more about right away. So I'm glad that finally we are here and we are able to share these details with you. So as Mike said, we are going to be spending some time today talking about the different conditions under which the ETAS service may be continued, and talk a bit about what some of the restrictions are in case we would need to deactivate that for your campus at any point. We will be giving some examples along the way, and we certainly do have time for questions at the end. One thing that I want to put out there just here at the beginning is that there are so many different scenarios and so many different examples of the service and what is happening on your campus that we won't be able to answer specific questions today. We will certainly do our best, but we really are relying on that assessment form to understand more what's happening on your campus so that we can give you the best answer and provide you with the best information. So we encourage your questions and we will do our best to answer them, but we are relying on the official kind of assessment process to have a complete conversation. So with that, I'm going to continue here. Turn it over to Sandra.
Great, thanks Jessica, and welcome everyone from me as well. As Mike said, in late March, in response to the COVID-19 emergency affecting most of our member libraries, HathiTrust leveraged the existing collaborative collection that had been digitized over the last 15 or so years to provide an emergency temporary access service for the duration of the emergency. Under this service, as all of you know, students, faculty, and staff at your institutions, when logged in and authenticated, can actually access the titles that are held in your library's print collection that are also digitized and held in the HathiTrust Digital Library. And that's described on the slide there. So we're at the point now, next slide please, where we have 152 campuses that are currently active with ETAS. 27 of the campuses that had earlier been activated have chosen over the course of the summer and in the last few weeks to deactivate as they have started resuming print access services again. And we are currently, as of today, reviewing 23 additional campuses and have approved 23 to continue ETAS for the fall term. And we have additional applications for assessment coming in, and we look forward to receiving yours. Next slide. Just to review quickly, our ETAS service is intended to be for an emergency and on a temporary basis. We require that the library experience an unexpected or involuntary and temporary emergency, a disruption to normal operations, requiring either that it's closed to the public, which is how we were looking at it back in the spring, or otherwise to show that there is a significant disruption to collection access services. We will continue this service for as long as our members need it. However, it is intended to end when the emergency ends and when people can resume normal print collection access services. We have a full terms of service and we hope you'll take a look at it. Next slide. One of the main terms of service that we like to emphasize a lot with folks, and hopefully you've heard this before, is that because the fair use access to the titles in the ETAS service depend upon the print collection items not being available, that's the whole reason for the service, you may not resume print lending of the titles and continue to have the ETAS service as well. That would violate our one-to-one principle for access for the works. And so we need to remind you that if you are planning to resume print lending of items that are held in ETAS that are available via ETAS, will need to deactivate. This means that you can't resume curbside delivery, mail delivery, or interlibrary loan of any of those print works. But do note that if you do some independent scanning of those print works and lend the scan, that's not a prohibition, that's not prohibited under our terms of service. You would want to proceed according to your normal procedures under appropriate use of copyright law in that case. Next slide. And because of that restriction, because of that primary term of service that we want to make sure you continue to adhere to if you continue to have ETAS service, we suggest that you mark your ETAS available items as non-circulating, either by physically removing them to another area of the library where they're not accessible for patrons to find, or by marking them in your catalog or your discovery system. And we have some advice for you about how to do that. There's some particular advice there for particular systems like Alma and Aleph that you may want to pay attention to if you're still looking at how to do that in your own catalog. And we're also happy to work with you. Just send a ticket to feedback@issues.hathitrust.org, the address that we'll have on the final slide today. And someone would be happy to work with you on how to figure out how to do that at your library. So now I'll turn it back to Jessica to talk about where we're going with our assessment for fall term 2020. Jessica?
Thank you, Sandra. All right. So as you've heard, many scenarios for continuing with ETAS are coming in all the time for us right now. There are many different scenarios all across the country, and we're finding that most of them do not conflict with the continuation of ETAS service. So I'll be going into more detail about what those different factors are that we are considering as we do the assessment. But right up front, I wanted to say that our intention in doing the assessment is not to police members or root out wrongdoers. It's really just to make sure that we are following the within the bounds of the fair use tenets that we are providing the service. So that's what we're doing. Again, not the copyright police. We just want to make sure that we continue working together within the bounds of fair use so that we can keep providing ETAS whenever and wherever your library services are disrupted due to the global health pandemic. So I'm going to get started here. So the primary question that all of the factors and conditions that you've been hearing about are related to really is the nature of the disruption to your library services. Is there a continued disruption to print collection access? And a lot of that comes down to what is your library and your institution having to do to maintain the health and safety of your campus community. So things such as campus access, that's related to who's coming back to campus, is there remote instruction? Library access, this has more to do with the physical being of your library, the facilities, and access related to hours or capacity. Then there's also the question of collection access, and that can be more specific to circulation or other kinds of activities that you might be doing to protect the health and safety of your staff in terms of sanitizing or any number of different conditions there. So I'm going to talk in more detail, but these are the primary questions, but there are many, many answers, and we understand that, and we are hoping even today to learn more about the creative ways that your campus community and library are making do in the given circumstances. So the first factor that we're considering in terms of the nature of an ongoing disruption to your library services is a restricted campus access. So restricted campus access can be anything from, as I said, certain groups of students or faculty not coming back to campus. Will there be all remote instruction? Are there certain library buildings that are closed? Or think there's a lot of different ways that communities are restricting campus access. We have this third bullet, a final bullet on all of our factors that really are meant to be the placeholder for those different ways that member institutions are handling the situation. So the second factor that we take into consideration is restricted library access. So to what extent is your library restricting access to protect the health and safety of your community? There is, in some instances, fewer hours, in some instances, more of a reduced capacity within the building. And all of these conditions really point to an ongoing restriction on library access. And again, that would be a clue to us as we're weighing these different factors that, man, it is just not normal out there. And again, in those instances, we want to be able to continue providing emergency temporary access service wherever and whenever your library operations are disrupted due to the pandemic. So again, we can imagine there are some creative ways that people are trying to address this, and the assessment process will help weed those out. The third factor that we're considering is the restricted collection access. This is related specifically to materials that you may be circulating or not circulating. Is there staff mediation? Is there actually a limit on the stacks themselves, or access to the stacks? So this is really specific to the collection, not so much campus, not so much the library facility, but actual collection and the items within that collection. So again, these three factors come together really to point at identifying the nature of the continued disruption to your library services due to the pandemic. So there are a few particular factors that state library systems and their associated campuses also need to keep in mind. As we weigh these different factors, campus access, library access, and collection access, when we're working with a state system and their different campuses, we have to consider a few other things. It gets a little bit in the weeds here, but we're trying to keep it fairly high level. Know that if you are one of these schools affiliated with a state system, we will work with you one-on-one to really make sure that these factors are clear to you. So the one piece is the authentication method. So some state systems, they all use the same authentication method to obtain access to HathiTrust and other services. Other state systems authenticate by campus. So depending on which one you happen to be in, there's a different path there. One of the primary things that we want to have everyone keep in mind, that if you are on an ETAS activated campus, whether you're a state system or not, you must not lend ETAS items outside your campus. And that is the same terms of service that have been in place before. It does get a little trickier when you're in a state system and you are a campus, for example, that has been deactivated for ETAS, activated for ETAS, we can't have cross-lending between those institutions. So again, there's a couple particular factors to keep in mind if you're part of a state system, but we will be working with you one-on-one to make sure that everything is clear. So the continuation assessment that we've been referring to really kicked off last week. We sent a message out to ETAS contacts at each member institution, asking them to complete a continuation assessment survey. And the survey really points to those three factors and helps us identify what conditions are in place that indicate restricted campus access, restricted library access, restricted collection access. And so as we look at these assessment forms, we're really weighing across the whole spread of them to make a determination about continued disruption to your library operations. So we'll be conducting these assessments throughout the month of August, and we will be turning those around pretty quickly. So we're doing this now for the upcoming term. For most of us, that is the fall semester. It might be a quarter, it might be a tri-quarter, but we anticipate that we will be doing this in future terms as well. So as we've been hearing from member libraries, and Sandra gave that snapshot kind of up front, so we've been able to hear from several dozen and get a real sense of what's happening on the ground from coast to coast. It's pretty fascinating. We have such a creative community too. I would say that of the dozens that we've received, pretty much every day we say, wow, did you hear what so-and-so school is doing and what so-and-so school is doing? Just some really creative ways that people are trying to support the ongoing teaching, learning, and research missions of their institution. But certainly it has an impact on what we are able to offer in terms of ETAS. So a couple scenarios here. One in particular, you can see the difference between, say, April 30th, 2020. This library had started using it, but they also started doing some on-demand scanning of titles that were not in ETAS. So they got in touch with us, said, hey, can we do this? Absolutely, that would not violate the terms of service. If the library, such as Library 3, is continuing or starting to circulate all titles in their collection, including ETAS titles, that would be a fairly clear kind of line in the sand of where we would not be able to continue ETAS service at that library. But again, we are weighing across all the different factors. So Library 4 really has some conditions that point to restricted library access, the fewer hours, fewer staff. And so again, we will be weighing all of those conditions to help make the best determination in terms of continued library disruptions. So some questions that we've been getting right off the bat. What if I just want to deactivate? You absolutely know that you're going to be circulating everything in your collection and you just want to deactivate, you even know your date. You can send a request to feedback@issues.hathitrust.org and we will work with you to make that happen. What if you're not sure if you still qualify? Absolutely. So the assessment process will help get to the answer to that question. But again, you can also send a request to feedback@issues.hathitrust.org. And what if you're disrupted again in 2 weeks? What if your library operations don't return to normal or do return to normal and then don't return to normal? You can request reactivation at any point as well. So the steps to request ETAS, very similar to the ones back in the spring. Much simpler, I would say. But yes, you would be able to reactivate if, again, your library is disrupted. So if in fact the determination is that based on the conditions that you've shared with us in your particular scenario at this given moment, we need to deactivate ETAS for your campus, we just want to put in a plug to give your campus community some advance notice. Many faculty, students have been relying on this service for their research, for learning, for their curriculum development, and just giving them a heads up would be a nice courtesy, and I'm sure they will love you even more for it. So we've got a couple tips here, some things to do that probably are obvious, but we always like to remind people in this busy time when our brains are full, put up a post on your website. A lot of people are going to those really COVID specific pages, so this would be a good place to put this announcement. Certainly let your reference staff know, your subject librarians, your liaison librarians, so they can help spread the word to their contacts and their departments on campus too. We also recommend removing the labels that would apply on in your catalog and in your discovery systems. Certainly, getting that out of people's view will help them understand what they have access to. And as always, promote HathiTrust. In your other resources, we've got some tools on our website that you can use to help with that effort as well. We also have a few templates for any deactivation messaging that you may need. And the link is there on this slide. So as mentioned before, we will be happy to reactivate ETAS for you in the event that you turn it off at the beginning of the term and find yourself a month later, if you turn it on at the beginning of the term or leave it on and find yourself at the midway mark through the term actually needing to restrict your library operations again, we will be happy to reactivate ETAS. As I mentioned, you can follow the same process as before. We don't have as many questions to ask. For example, we've already pretty much settled the authentication and affiliation question. So we really will be happy to continue to provide ETAS wherever and whenever your library is disrupted due to the global health pandemic. So next steps in the assessment process is to, if you have not already, check with the ETAS contact at your library to get the assessment survey going. If you have already submitted it, then you are on a roll. If you think you might need to submit it again, that is absolutely fine. We wanted to make sure that everybody had it in hand. We will be working on these throughout the month of August. So on an ongoing basis, we are just processing these. Usually takes us a couple days to really look at all the factors and make sure that we provide the best feedback, the best recommendation possible for you. So once we've determined whether you are able to continue using ETAS or not based on the conditions that you've shared with us, then you really don't need to contact us again this term. As long as you're following the terms of service, and you don't have any major changes to your library operations, then just coast on along. We want this to be of least disruption to your academic community as possible. So our move really is to assess this regularly, but term by term versus week after week after week. So that is really what you can expect next. And we are here for you and any questions you might have. I'll welcome my other colleagues back too.
All right, thanks, Jessica. I will get started with some questions. Here is one. I understand some international students are having difficulty obtaining student visas. Would this constitute an exception under factor number 1?
And I'm happy to take that. Yes, anytime that you have restrictions on your faculty, students, and staff being able to return to campus, that would be a condition that would weigh in favor of continuing ETAS for you. So that would be definitely one of the things we would consider. The restrictions on international students are likely due to the pandemic emergency. And so that would be something that we would weigh as one of the conditions.
Can we share the entire survey as a preview PDF? It looks like you have to work through it live right now.
I can answer that. I can provide that in a PDF format. I know I had a request earlier today from someone who wanted to make sure she was able to share it with more of her team members. So if you send a message to feedback@request.hathitrust.org and just indicate that you would like to have a PDF of that survey, that would be fine.
Can we use ETAS for interlibrary loan or document delivery when my library opens? Can I use any print items?
I'd be happy to take that one. You wouldn't be able, under our terms of service, you wouldn't be able to either download something from the ETAS service for use for ILL document delivery, or to use the print items on which those items are based. So our fair use provision of the service means that it constrains you from being able to lend those materials.
If I have access to something via ETAS but have 2 print copies, can you allow our library to have digital access via ETAS for one and circulate the other copy?
I'll take that one too. Unfortunately, no. We treat your print holdings in their entirety. So, you know, we would be giving you access to both copies via ETAS and asking you not to lend either copy in print. And I realize that's a hard choice for some people to make, and it would be nice to be able to have that in another way because of the varying needs that you have. But unfortunately, we do have to put you at a point of choice, either the ETAS access for both of the copies, or we turn off ETAS and you can again resume lending of the print.
Can we circulate something if we check and see the ETAS copy is not checked out?
Absolutely. And again, we encourage you to have good processes in place for checking that something is available via ETAS, and you're free to do your normal lending practices with everything else. But please do check either by marking it as non-circulating in your catalog or your discovery system, or having some kind of manual way to segregate the ETAS available works physically in your library, or some a way to check the overlap report that we provide you at the circulation desk. But we do ask you to put into place some way to restrict that, and otherwise we don't restrict your other lending.
Retirees do not have access to ETAS. Has there been any discussions about expanding access to this group?
What we have done so far is, if the when we have had special requests about this, is we've asked back to the library, do you consider this group of affiliates that are authenticated through your system to be an integral part of providing the instructional or research mission of your university? Our original limitation to faculty, staff, and students was because we believe that the fair use case is strongest for HathiTrust and protects HathiTrust the most if we are making the argument in terms of the people who are essential to the instructional and research mission of the university. For some libraries, some retirees are included in their standard member authentication. The value of member is returned for them because the libraries consider that portion of that group to be essential to the mission of the university. In other libraries, it's treated differently. We can work with you one-on-one to ask specifics about your situation. But typically we don't include, we have included emerita when requested as much as we can, if they're segregated out as a separate group, or if they're included as part of the value member that's returned in authentication. And typically we don't include staff retirees and any other affiliates or guests.
Okay, Sandra, I want to go back and I'm going to ask another question again because several of our attendees missed the answer.
Oh, sorry, maybe I wasn't complete enough. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we circulate something if we check and see the ETAS copy is not checked out?
So if you have any copies at all of the item, they are ETAS copies. So there's not just one ETAS copy. If you have 3 copies, you're constrained from circulating any of those 3 copies. I'm not sure if that was part of the confusion behind my earlier answer. But when you declare it in your print holdings as something that you hold, we provide access to however many copies you have of it via ETAS, and you're not able to provide any access to any of those copies in print. If you check and see if you check something and it's not available via ETAS, in other words, it's not an overlap between your print collection and the HathiTrust collection, then you're free to circulate it however you normally do and under whatever terms you normally circulate it. But if it's available via ETAS, you may not circulate the print copy. I hope that helps. Maybe if I still haven't hit the question behind, if I still haven't understood the question, please try again.
Sure. I have actually another question that we want to try to repeat. Can we use ETAS for interlibrary loan or document delivery when my library opens?
So there are a couple of ways to interpret that. Let me just try real quick on, we certainly welcome you sharing a link to an ETAS item to people who can log in and get access to it. So to your faculty, staff, and students. So if you're requested something and you have it and you want to make it available via ETAS, we suggest you send them the link. You won't be able to use the print item to fulfill that ILL or document delivery request, as long as you have ETAS. If you deactivate ETAS, of course, then you could resume the print lending. But that is, in our terms of service, is a pretty strong line that we need to make sure to observe. I think there was just a clarification of that there at the end. Oh, sorry, I mean the scanning of items that are in ETAS. Yeah. Yes, okay. Sarah, yes, thank you for clarifying. Yes, if you are independently scanning the items that are in ETAS, you can do whatever you normally do with them under whatever terms, whatever common practices that are appropriate for under copyright law. You can manage those as you normally do.
Okay, next question. May we deactivate ETAS temporarily, not because of a change in library services, but simply in order to allow physical item circulation on a temporary basis, say for 1 month, to meet a preference expressed by some users? Is deactivating and reactivating burdensome for HathiTrust?
That's an interesting idea, and we really have been impressed with all the creative and interesting ideas people are trying to come up with to serve their patrons as best they can. If you deactivate ETAS, we assume that means that you are able to resume print access services. And then if you choose then to reactivate, or if you attempt to reactivate ETAS later, we will be asking you to tell us that you actually have compromised services again. So if that happens to be the case, if you are able to provide services and then later not able to provide services, this kind of going back and forth can certainly work, as Jessica said earlier in a slide where she showed changing practices over time. But if it's a planned matter for the convenience of patrons, then I'm afraid we would probably have to ask, do you really still qualify for emergency service? Are you still really unable to provide services? And we would want to feel confident that it wasn't something that you were doing that would be in some sense gaming the system. So we'd have to talk to you about that.
Here's just a general one. What are the things we need to consider when deactivating ETAS?
I think there's a number of different things to consider. I'm not sure exactly what angle you might be thinking. I certainly am thinking mostly about letting your users know, and whether that's through communication methods, one-on-one, reference support, or, within their usual interface for your catalog or discovery systems. But in terms of, initiating the request, you would need to just fill out that assessment form or contact us at feedback@issues.hathitrust.org. And there shouldn't be much beyond that. A lot of it happens on the back end for us. We would be able to work with you and identify a date. So you could, have some mindful planning if you wanted to give yourself a little time to work out those details. But really, it's just letting us know either through that assessment form or a request that you would want to deactivate. And then there's some of those other pieces to keep in mind, just to support your community and their awareness of what resources they have available to them going into this next term.
Any more questions? I am not seeing any more questions in the chat.
All right. I think we can wrap it up for the afternoon then. We will certainly be sending out the slides afterwards, as well as a brief survey. We will post the webinar as well. You'll get a link to that too. So if you have additional questions as you go through the process, definitely contact us, feedback@issues.hathitrust.org. And we look forward to working with you on this process and supporting you as you make this big move into the next term. So thank you all for joining us today.